The topic for this video is Module 3, Inputs and Tools, Chapter 5, Macroeconomics for the CFA Institute Investment Foundations Program. So just very briefly, we're in Module 3, Inputs and Tools, so we're moving on now to Chapter 5, Macroeconomics, and you can see that there are 57 questions in the learning ecosystem, 4 more than microeconomics, but I must say I do find personally that macroeconomics is maybe a little bit easier than the microeconomics. You don't have so many charts and graphs and movements along the curve and movements of the curve. So again, a quick little study tip, one of the things that I may want to do just before jumping into a new session, I may just want to go back and read the summary of the microeconomics, because as I said, as we move forward, sometimes we move back, do a little bit of review, then we start fresh and we move forward. So here I am in the learning ecosystem for the CFA Institute Investment Foundations Program. The topic for this video is macroeconomics in Module 3. So you can see the learning would start here, but as I said, one of the tips that I may want to do before I jump into a new reading, I may just want to go back and look at the summary for the previous reading, Chapter 3. And as I mentioned, you may want to even make a binder that has just the reading chapters printed out from the PDFs. And I think that you'll find for economics in particular, because there's quite a high number of learning outcome statements, that the summaries are a very valuable resource. So you can see quite a few bullet points in this summary, a lot of valuable information. Not, there's going to be things that are tested that are from the text, of course, but the summaries do cover a lot of the information. Then I would click through and you can see we're going to be moving into macroeconomics for this video. And here are the learning outcome statements for this chapter. Learning outcome statement A is describe why macroeconomic considerations are important to an investment firm and how macroeconomic information may be used. Learning outcome statement B, define gross domestic product, GDP, and GDP per capita. Learning outcome statement C, identify basic components of GDP. Learning outcome statement D, describe economic growth and factors that affect it. LOS E is describe phases of a business cycle and their characteristics. LOS F is explain the global nature of business cycles. Learning outcome statement G, describe economic indicators and their uses and limitations. H is define inflation, deflation, stagflation, and hyperinflation, and describe how inflation affects consumers, businesses, and investments. LOSI is describe and compare monetary and fiscal policy. And finally, the last learning outcome statement, J, is explain limitations of monetary and fiscal policy. Before we jump into the learning outcome statements in the lesson, I just want to give another quick tip on using the learning ecosystem. So I'm going to jump over here and click on practice, and you can see if I scroll up on the macroeconomics, I've done the practice questions, 57 of 57. I've got 75%, not bad, could be better. I'm targeting over 70, so not too bad. So if I click on that, you can see 100% completion. It's giving me some average answer time. You can see I go through this fairly quickly, 9 seconds average correct answer time, 11 seconds on the incorrect answer time. Anyhow, I just wanted to show you a couple of things here. I did get a couple of mistakes wrong. So here, if we click on the filter, we can click on correctness, and I can review just the questions that I've got wrong by filtering the incorrect, okay? And then also over here, if I click on the difficulty, it's going to go from easy to moderate to difficult to expert. So you can clearly see that most of my questions that I got wrong were in the difficult to expert category, and that's what you would suspect. And then another functionality is if you just click on the question here, it'll pop open and show you what the question was. So the largest component of total GDP is most likely to be gross investment, government spending, or C, household or consumer household spending. And then if I want to review, I answered C, answered B, government spending. No, it's C, consumer and household spending. So it says consumer and household spending is the largest component of total spending and may be as high as 70% of total GDP. Okay, so then I can go back. I might want to bookmark this, or I can record a note, okay? And the next thing that I want to point out is that I was saying that when I get something wrong, I want to go back to the text. Well, here you can click on this, learn more about this topic, and it'll bring up the area of the text where perhaps you might have gotten it wrong. So you can see I can scroll up here. It says GDP. It's talking about nominal and real GDP, and you know, I can pop into the specific lesson and try to find where I made my mistake. So I can click that off, and I'm done reviewing perhaps. And again, click on difficulty. I can do a sort here, and I can filter, trying to see just the questions that I got wrong. Click on the question, see what the question was. Click on the review, see why I made my mistake, and perhaps jump into the lesson and learn more about that topic. It's going to take me to the learning outcome statement and the area that has the relevant information. So once you get once you start practicing with the learning ecosystem, it gets easier and easier, and your reviewing and your practicing becomes more and more efficient. Okay. Learning outcome statement A is describe why macroeconomic considerations are important to an investment firm and how macroeconomic information may be used. Well, macroeconomics is the study of the economy as a whole. Macroeconomics considers the effects of such factors as inflation, economic growth, interest rates, exchange rates, and unemployment on economic activity. The effects of these factors on business, consumer, and government economic decisions represent an intersection of micro and macroeconomics. Macroeconomic conditions affect the actions and behavior of businesses, consumers, and governments. Investment professionals use macroeconomic data to forecast the earnings potential of companies and determine which asset classes may be more attractive. An asset class is a broad grouping of similar types of investments, such as stocks, bonds, real estate, and commodities. So there's some situations where the forecast may be that stocks are going to perform better than bonds, and that has implications for certain types of investors. Learning outcome statement B is define gross domestic product, GDP, and GDP per capita, okay? So gross domestic product, GDP, also known as total output, is the total value of all final products and services produced within a country over some time period. Economists may express it on a per capita basis, which is equal to GDP divided by the population. GDP per capita is a standardized measure that allows comparison between countries or over time in a country because it is adjusted to reflect different population levels among countries or changes in population levels within a country. So starting here on the left-hand side, we can see that total GDP can be calculated in two ways. The first way is by using the expenditure approach, and in this case, GDP equals consumer spending plus business gross investment plus government spending, and then plus in the brackets here, you have exports minus imports, okay? And on this side, we have the income approach, where GDP equals the gross domestic income. Gross domestic income should equal gross domestic product. After all, what one economic entity spends is another economic entity's income. So the equivalent relationship is a useful cross-check when statisticians are measuring economic activity, because in practice, GDP is hard to measure and subject to error. So the results of the two approaches can be compared to ensure that the measure of GDP reflects the economic output of an economy. So continuing with the defining GDP and GDP per capita, now we're looking at the components of the GDP, and we can see a little bit old data from 2010. In the light blue, we've got United States, and the little bit darker blue, we've got Japan, but it's just showing what is the largest component. And you can see here that consumer spending is the largest component for GDP for both United States and Japan back in 2010. And you can see that it's very close to this 70%. And that was one of the practice problems in the learning ecosystem, okay? Then you can see that, again, just the formula for GDP, just to remind you, consumer spending plus gross investment plus government spending plus, and then it's brackets, exports minus imports, okay? And the largest component of GDP is consumer spending. Learning outcome statement C is identify the basic components of GDP, and we've done that. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus brackets X minus M, and GDP is the sum of the following components. Consumer household spending, which is the largest component and sometimes close to 70% of GDP. Then you've got C plus I, gross investment or business spending, plus G, government and spending, plus brackets X minus M, exports minus imports. So exports are included as spending on domestic output and are added to GDP, whereas imports are subtracted from GDP. Now this is an important slide, an important point. We're looking at now nominal versus real GDP, okay? So nominal GDP minus changes in the price level equals the real GDP. Nominal GDP, which reflects the current market value of products and services, is unadjusted for price changes. It may overstate or understate the actual economic growth. Real GDP is nominal GDP adjusted for changes in the price levels. Changes in real GDP, which reflect changes in actual physical output, are a better measure of economic growth than changes in nominal GDP. So just to clarify or explain a little bit more, GDP changes as the amount spent changes, but changes in the amount spent could be the result of changes in either the quantity purchased or the prices of products and services purchased. So if a change in GDP is solely the result of changes in prices with no accompanying increase in the quantity of products purchased, then the economic production of the company is not changed. This is equivalent to a company increases its prices by 5% and reporting a subsequent 5% increase in sales. In fact, the company's production has not increased, so looking at nominal reported sales would not accurately reflect the change in output. Similarly, nominal GDP, which reflects the current market value of products and services unadjusted for price changes, may over or understate actual economic growth. So changes in real GDP, which reflect changes in actual physical output, are a better measure of economic growth than changes in nominal GDP. Learning outcome statement D is describe economic growth and factors that affect it. So you can see here we've got three factors: growth of labor force, productivity gains, and availability of capital. Economic growth is measured by the percentage change in real output, usually real GDP for a country. Real GDP measures the products and services available to the citizens of that country. Real GDP per capita is a useful measure to assess changes in wealth and living standards. The trend rate of GDP growth is determined at its most simplest level by growth in the labor force plus productivity gains subject to the availability of capital to produce more products and services. Productivity is a function of the efficiency of a worker and the available technology. For example, without technological change, a worker assembling cell phones may be able to increase production from 1 cell phone per hour to 2 cell phones per hour and thus become more efficient. However, with a technological change, a worker may be able to produce 3 cell phones per hour. The increase in productivity is because of increased worker efficiency and the availability of technology. Computer technology has revolutionized business operations. For example, some aspects of automobile production are computerized, and the internet allows consumers to perform tasks they formerly outsourced to service companies, such as booking airline travel. Technology is also disruptive in the sense that new occupations have been created, but other occupations have been rendered irrelevant. This slide is looking at annual GDP growth rates at market prices based on local currency from 1971 to 2010. It's coming from the World Bank, so the data is a little bit old, probably could be updated. Anyhow, a couple of key things just come out of this slide, though, regardless of the timing of the data. Developed countries typically have aging populations and lower birth rates, so their potential labor force will grow slowly or even decline. The exhibit on the slide shows the annual GDP growth rates in a sample of countries from 1971 to 2010. So note that the growth rates in the developed countries shown, Germany through Canada, was in the range of 2 to 3%. The growth rate in the emerging countries of Brazil, India, and China was much higher. Over time, as economies grow and transition from emerging to developed, the GDP growth rates are expected to move towards the more sustainable rates of 2 to 3%. Some developed countries, such as Japan, are experiencing a decline in population. This decline will require increases in productivity or a technological revolution if GDP is to remain at the long-term trend rate. This is another reason why GDP per capita may be a more useful measure than total GDP to evaluate the economic well-being of a country's citizens. If GDP grows at a faster rate than the population growth rate, or if GDP shrinks at a lower rate than the population shrinkage rate, it'll result in a higher GDP per capita. Learning Outcome Statement E is describe phases of a business cycle and their characteristics. So here we can see a stylized exhibit of a business cycle. On the y-axis, we've got the GDP growth rate, and on the x-axis, we have time. Okay, so you can see that the GDP growth rate does fluctuate over time, and they've got different phases of the business cycle, which you need to be able to memorize. So if we just started from left to right, we start with the peak, then the contraction, the trough, recovery, expansion, and then we're back to peak. So one of the things that you need to do is you need to memorize not only the terms, but also the order that the contraction follows the peak and is before the trough. The trough follows the contraction and is before the recovery. The recovery is after the trough, but before the expansion, and the expansion happens after the recovery, but before the peak, because this can be tested as most likely or least likely. The recovery phase of the cycle follows which phase? And then you have to remember, oh, the recovery follows the trough, okay? So PCTRE, that's the stages of the business cycle. Those are the terms: peak, contraction, trough, recovery, expansion, back to peak. And in the next slide, we're going to look at the characteristics of each of these stages of the business cycle, and that also gets heavily tested in terms of what our characteristics are unique to each stage of the business cycle. So here I've just put the business cycle again, the little graphic: peak, contraction, trough, recovery, and expansion. And here are some of the characteristics, and it's important that you're familiar with these characteristics because it gets tested most likely, least likely, characteristic of which phase of the business cycle. So let's go through this fairly quickly. When we're looking at the expansion phase, production increases. That's fairly intuitive. But we need to also look at what's happening with inflation and interest rates. So inflation and interest rates tend to rise during the expansion, and there's a high rate of employment resulting in higher wages. Now, I think that's fairly intuitive. The economy is expanding. Inflation and interest rates are tending to rise as the economy heats up, and a high rate of employment results in higher wages. And of course, production is increasing. It's expanding. If we move to the peak, monetary policy is aimed at slowing growth because the economy is hitting the peak stage and controlling inflation. Later on, we'll see some of the tools of the monetary policy, how they would slow growth and control inflation. It's probably mostly through increasing interest rates, okay? Economic shocks or other factors may contribute to the end of an expansion. When we're looking at the contraction phase, we can see here unemployment is starting to increase. Unemployment increases. Inflation and interest rates tend to fall, so that's the opposite to the expansion phase. And monetary and fiscal policies are designed to stimulate growth. Again, we're going to see more about monetary and fiscal policies later. Fiscal policies relate to government's ability to tax, increase taxes or decrease taxes, and government expenditures. They can spend more money or spend less money. So fiscal policy, expenditures and taxes. Monetary policy is through control of the size of the money supply and the growth rate of the money supply. And finally here, the trough and recovery phases. Contraction ends and economic growth stabilizes. Business, investment, and consumer demand pick up, and the economy enters a recovery phase. Learning outcome statement F is explain the global nature of the business cycles. So again, it's looking at some, this is a graph. We can see annual GDP growth rate on the y-axis, and we can see time on the x-axis, and we're looking at 3 countries. The blue line, United States, the dotted green line is Germany, and the dashed darker blue line is the UK, okay? So with growth of international trade, mobility of labor, and more closely connected capital markets, movements in the business cycle of countries have also become more closely aligned with each other. The cycles are transmitted between countries through trade and integrated financial markets. One country's economic growth often leads to a higher level of imports, which creates a larger export market for other countries. Increased exports will lead to economic growth in exporting countries. Investing and borrowing occur in increasingly integrated financial markets. Financial panics can spread rapidly throughout the global economy, as the world experienced in the financial crisis that started in 2008, which we can see here. Pretty much all 3 countries were closely aligned in this global crisis, where you can see there was negative GDP growth rate. That's the 2008 global financial crisis, okay? Economic policies of governments are more likely to be coordinated through the integration of financial markets and international policy forums, such as the G20 meetings. The G20 is a group with representatives from 19 countries, the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, that meets to discuss economic and financial policy issues. Learning outcome statement G is describe economic indicators and their uses and limitations. Real GDP, which is typically estimated quarterly, is an important measure of the wealth of a country, but is estimated with a substantial time lag. Furthermore, estimated and reported GDP are subject to revisions over time as more data becomes available. The revisions can occur well over a year after the original report date. So economic indicators are measures that offer insight regarding economic activity and are reported with greater frequency than GDP. Economic indicators are estimated and reported by governments and private institutions. They can be used to guide forecasts of future economic activity, as well as forecasts of activity and performance in the financial markets and exchange rates. Industrial production is available monthly and reports the output produced by the industrial sector of the economy, namely the output produced by the manufacturing, mining, and utility companies. It excludes the agricultural and service sectors, which can be significant contributors to economic activity. So that's important to understand, is that the economic indicator for industrial production does not include agricultural and service sectors. So here's a list of some economic indicators. I'm not going to go through a detailed description of each. It's in the text. But some of the economic indicators that are looked at by economists. Number 1 is average weekly hours of production workers. Number 2, initial claims for unemployment insurance. 3, durable products orders. 4, retail sales. 5, construction spending. And finally, 6, sentiment surveys, which measure the confidence that economic entities have in the economy. Okay, this slide is quite important. It's talking about lagging indicators, coincident indicators, and leading indicators. So when we're looking at different economic indicators, we want to ask, when did the economic activity occur? So lagging indicators is looking in the past. Coincident indicators are looking at the present. and leading indicators is looking at the future. Okay, so key economic indicators are often categorized as lagging, coincident, or leading based on whether they signal, indicate that changes in economic activity have already happened, are currently underway, or are likely to happen in the future. Lagging indicators signal a change in economic activity after output has already changed. An example of a lagging indicator is the employment rate, which tends to fall after economic activity has already declined. Coincident indicators reveal current economic conditions, but they do not have predictive value, so that's an important point. Examples of coincident indicators include industrial production and personal income statistics. Leading indicators usually signal changes in the economy in the future and thus are considered useful for economic prediction and policy formulation. Examples of leading indicators include a money supply, the amount of money in circulation, and broad stock market indices such as the S&P 500 index, the FTSE index, and the Hang Seng index. So that's looking at US, UK, and Hong Kong. A number of organizations publish indices of leading economic indicators, which combine the results of different indicators to signal what might happen in the future. Okay, I'm just going to show you a quick study tip here. So again, I've been mentioning that the summaries are really important, but you need to be able to also go back and look at the finer details in the text. So this is a perfect example. So here you can see I've highlighted economic, I'm in the summary for the chapter. Economic indicators are measures of economic activity, are regularly reported and analyzed, and these measures may be leading, lagging, or coincident indicators, but they don't tell us what those indicators are and whether they, which indicators are leading, lagging, or coincident. And of course, that's what's going to be tested. So you got to make sure that you've gone through the text and also made some notes. So I've gone back to the text here. You can see lagging indicators after output, and a lagging indicator is the employment rate. So that I might want to highlight. Okay, coincident indicators don't have predictive value, and that's industrial production and personal income statistics are examples of coincident indicators. And leading indicators include the money supply and broad stock market indices such as the S&P 500. So when I'm doing my flashcards or my memory cards, I'm going to have lagging, coincident, leading, and then beside it I'm going to have a couple of keywords: employment rate for lagging, industrial production and personal income for coincident, and for leading, money supply and S&P 500. So again, you need to the summaries are useful, but you need to complement the summaries with a little bit of extra keywords. And finally, just to show you from the Learning Econ system that is exactly how the way it can be tested. You can see here was question 47 and 57. Which of the following is a lagging economic indicator? A, employment rate, B, industrial production, or C, the broad stock market index? And we can see that A is correct. A lagging indicator signals a change in economic activity after output has already changed. So an example of leading indicator is the employment rate. It falls after economic activity has already declined. B is incorrect. Industrial production is an example of a coincident indicator. And C is incorrect. A broad stock market index like the S&P 500 is a leading indicator of economic activity. So you can see by going through the summary and going through the reading with a little bit more detail, picking up on some key points, and then going through the practice questions, you'll be in fine shape to tackle the test, the exam. Now we're moving on to Learning Outcome Statement H, which is define inflation, deflation, stagflation, and hyperinflation, and describe their effects on consumers, businesses, and investments. So there's going to be 4 slides with regards to this learning outcome statement. And the first important thing to understand is that there are many different measures of inflation based on different indices. The basic measure of inflation is the percentage change in the index from period to period. So that's a very important point. The basic measure of inflation is the percentage change in the index from period to period. Consumer Price Index, CPI, is constructed by determining the weight or relative importance of each good and service in a typical household spending, referred to as a basket of goods, in a particular base year and then measuring the overall price change from year to year. Weights in this index can be altered when long-term consumer trends change. Inflation measured by the CPI may overstate or understate inflation for a particular consumer or household, depending on how their spending patterns compare with the basket of goods. Another key thing to understand is that in different countries, terminology may vary, and the basket of goods is very likely to vary. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, at least 2 consumer price indices are reported. The first one, a retail price index, RPI, is based on a basket of goods that includes housing costs, and a CPI with a smaller basket of goods that does not include some items such as housing. Okay? So inflation rates as measured by the UK RPI and CPI are typically not the same. This slide is continuing with some inflation indicators, and the Producer Price Index, the PPI, is another measure of inflation. It measures the average selling price of products in the economy. It is broader than the CPI because it includes the price of investment products, but is also narrower in that it does not include services. So producer price indices are published several ways. 1, by individual industries, 2, by commodity classifications, and 3, by the stage of processing products such as raw materials and finished products. Different indices can produce different inflation measures even in the same country over the same period. So the relationship between CPIs and PPIs is sometimes used to determine the degree to which producers' costs are passed on to consumers. The implicit GDP deflator is simply defined as nominal GDP divided by real GDP. It is the broadest based measure of a nation's inflation rate. So now we're moving on to the next part of the learning outcome statement, and really what we're looking at next is the effect of inflation, in particular the effect on consumers, businesses, and investments. So changes in price levels can affect economic growth because consumers and businesses may change based on anticipated changes in prices. Number 1, the timing of their purchases. Number 2, the amount of their spending. Number 3, their savings and borrowing decisions. And finally, the value of investments may also be affected by changes in the price level. So if we look at consumers, if consumers expect prices to increase, they may buy now rather than save, or they may choose to borrow to increase their spending. Borrowers benefit from inflation because they repay loans with money that is worth less. It has lower purchasing power. However, the added spending may only benefit economic growth in the short run because some of those purchases would have been made anyway. So inflation may simply shift demand from the future to the current time period. This added short-term demand can further increase inflationary pressure. During times of inflation, wages may not increase at the same rate as the prices of products and services. If wages increase by a lesser amount, consumers may have less money to spend as their budgets are squeezed. So what is the impact of inflation on businesses? Generally, inflation will have a negative effect on planning and investment. Budgeting becomes more difficult because of the uncertainty created by rising prices and costs. Consumers spend rather than invest, so access to capital is reduced for companies, which results in reduced business spending on physical productive capital. Companies' profits may decline as costs rise, particularly if companies are unable to pass on the higher costs to consumers in the form of higher prices. So if inflation becomes established, overall economic performance may deteriorate as companies raise prices and are potentially unable to invest in capital and seek productivity improvements. So finally, how does inflation affect the value of financial investments? Well, as inflation increases, interest rates generally rise. Any investment paying a fixed cash amount will decline in value if interest rates rise. So we're going to see that in the chapter on bonds. As interest rates increase, the bond prices go down. Okay, the price of the bond goes down. So inflation tends to benefit borrowers and it hurts lenders. Shares, on the other hand, may be a good hedge, protection against inflation, if companies are able to increase the selling prices of their products or services as their input prices increase. So now we're down to the last slide for this learning outcome statement, and we're going to look at other inflation scenarios, which is deflation, stagflation, and hyperinflation. And what you need to do is understand the terms. Of course, they're in the glossary, but so let's just have a quick look. Deflation is a persistent and pronounced decrease in prices across most products and services. So inflation is an increase in prices across most products and services, and deflation is a decrease. So demand declines as a result of expected further price declines. Okay, so that's the important point to pick up with regards to deflation. Stagflation is a combination of little or no economic growth and inflation. Okay, and it typically results from inflation that originates outside the domestic economy. And finally, hyperinflation, that involves price increases so large and rapid that people find it difficult to purchase products and services, most commonly associated with emerging markets, and may cause severe damage to the economy. So we're in 2018 right now. You may want to go and investigate, Google search hyperinflation and see some countries that may be experiencing that right now. One that comes to mind is perhaps Venezuela. Okay. So again, one of my study tips that I said is that if you have the time, sometimes it's good to bring the real world into the classroom. So when you're studying this chapter on macroeconomics and it's talking about hyperinflation, why not try to Google search hyperinflation and see what comes up? As I said, Venezuela is a country that's currently experiencing some hyperinflation. So if I just Google search hyperinflation Venezuela, I get the some articles here. The path to hyperinflation, what happened to Venezuela, from Forbes magazine. Venezuela hyperinflation, 24 months and coming. You can see that's just from the fall, October 2018. And so there's some different articles. I always recommend that when you're going through some of the content, try to read newspaper articles, magazine articles, go out and find examples that help you complement the curriculum and the theory. And you may not only enjoy it, but it'll also help you understand and digest the curriculum and perhaps help you do better on the exam. Now we're moving on to Learning Outcome Statement I, which is describe and compare monetary and fiscal policy. Okay, monetary policy refers to central bank activities that are directed towards influencing the money supply and credit in an economy. The ultimate goal is to influence macroeconomic targets such as output or GDP, price stability, and employment. Most central banks have a mandate of maintaining price stability, controlling inflation, while avoiding deflation, with indirect effects on other macroeconomic targets such as employment and output. Many central banks have additional responsibilities to sustain employment levels and to stimulate or slow down economic growth. The latter responsibility is interlinked with inflation because high economic growth is often accompanied by inflation. Consumers and companies should, in theory, be encouraged by lower interest rates to borrow and spend more and thus stimulate the economy. Similarly, increased interest rates may slow the economy. Okay, this slide is continuing on with monetary policy, and we're looking at three monetary tools here. One is open market operations, two is central bank official interest rates, and number three are reserve requirements. Okay, so this is quite important content to understanding central bank monetary policy and the tools that they use. So open market operations involve the purchase and sale of government notes and bonds. If the central bank wants to increase the supply of money and credit, it can do so by purchasing financial assets, generally short-term government instruments held by commercial banks. The banks give up short-term government instruments for cash, which puts more money in circulation. So the injection of money allows banks to lower interest rates and make more loans to economic agents because they now have more cash reserves at the central bank. So note that the central bank does not set the rates, but rather uses open market operations to influence the rates. To reduce the supply of money and credit in circulation, the central bank sells these instruments to the commercial banks. This approach reduces the money supply. The commercial banks have lower balances at the central bank and more short-term government instruments. The decrease in cash balances reduces the credit available to the private sector. Interest rates rise as consumers and companies compete for smaller amounts of credit. So you just have to understand that if a central bank wants to increase the supply of money, it purchases financial assets. And if it wants to decrease the supply of money, it will sell financial assets. Moving on now to the central bank official interest rates. The central bank official interest rate is the rate at which banks borrow directly from the central bank of the country. The name of this official interest rate varies among countries. It is used to affect short-term interest rates as well as to indirectly influence longer-term and other commercial rates. The belief is that changes in interest rates can influence economic activity and affect inflation and economic growth. So if a central bank announces an increase in its official policy rate, then commercial banks will normally increase their lending base rates at the same time. So the central bank increases its official policy rate, and the bank rates are going to make it more expensive to borrow money, on mortgages, credit cards, car loans, etc., and that'll tend to cool the economy off, okay? So the higher the central bank lending rate, the more likely banks are to reduce lending and thus decrease the money supply, which is expected to slow down economic activity. Similarly, lower central bank lending rates are expected to stimulate the economic activity. And finally, finishing with the reserve requirement over here. The reserve requirement is the proportion of deposits that must be held by a bank rather than being lent to borrowers. By increasing the reserve requirement, central banks reduce access to credit in the economy because bank lending is reduced. So when they lower the reserve requirement, central banks increase activity to credit because commercial banks are able to make more loans, okay? So in practice, this tool is not often used by central banks. Okay, this is a little bit outside of the curriculum for the Investment Foundations program. It's meant to complement it. What I'm doing here is I'm looking at the Bank of Canada website, www.Bank of Canada, because I want to apply some of the learnings that I'm seeing in the curriculum to the real world. So I'm using Canada as the example. So the Bank of Canada, what's its core functions? You can see monetary policy, financial system, currency, and funds management. So mostly we've been talking about the monetary policy. And you can see the policy interest rate here is 1.75% as of December 5th, 2018. And if I click on that, you can see that the policy interest rate has been increasing over the last period of time. So if we go back to July 2017, you can see the policy interest rate was 0.75%, and it's been increasing 1.5% to 1.75%. You can see the last announcement, there's been no change, and that's 0.25% change. That's a 1.25 to 1.5 to 1.75. You can see the increments are 0.25%, which is we call 25 basis points, okay? And going back here, we can see that the total CPI inflation, 1.7%. And again, if we click on that, it's going to bring up some key inflation indicators and the target range. So it's talking about CPI, and it's giving us a little bit of a graph, okay? The next thing that I'm going to do is just going to click on this monetary policy, and you can see that there's a lot of good information here to learn about the objective of Canada's monetary policy and the main instruments used to implement it, which is the inflation control target and the flexible exchange rate, okay? So you can see here the objective of monetary policy is to preserve the value of money by keeping inflation low, stable, and predictable. This allows Canadians to make spending and investment decisions with more confidence, encourages longer-term investment in Canada's economy, and contributes to sustained job creation and greater productivity. Okay, so it's talking about the inflation control target, and you can see at the heart of Canada's monetary policy framework is the inflation control target, which is 2%, and that's the midpoint of a 1 to 3% target range. Okay, further moving on a little bit, you can see the target for the overnight rate. So the target for the overnight rate, also known as the key policy interest rate, is the interest rate that the bank expects to be used in financial markets for one day or overnight loans between financial institutions. This key rate serves as the benchmark that banks and other financial institutions use to set interest rates for consumers' loans, mortgages, and other forms of lending. And so there's a blurb here on influencing the short-term interest rates. So to achieve the inflation target, the bank adjusts, raises, or lowers its key policy rate. If inflation is above a target, the bank may raise the policy rate. Doing so encourages financial institutions to increase interest rates on their loans and mortgages, discouraging borrowing and spending, and thereby easing upward pressure on prices. Okay? Monetary policy actions take time. There's a bit of a lag. A little bit about the exchange. And so down here, it's really nice. You've got some monetary policy backgrounders. So there's a PDF target for the overnight rate, about the bank rate, lending rates, how monetary policy works, the transmission of monetary policy. So again, one of my study tips is from time to time, if you have the time, then it's nice to go outside the curriculum of what you're studying and try to see, gather some information from the real world. And in my humble opinion, the Bank of Canada has a very excellent website that complements the curriculum in the CFA Institute Investment Foundations program with respect to the chapter on macroeconomics and specifically on monetary policy. Learning Outcome Statement J is explain limitations of monetary and fiscal policy. So the effectiveness of monetary policy is subject to debate. Economists who question its effectiveness cite evidence of slow growth in some economies where interest rates are very low. This result may occur because consumers and companies do not respond to lower interest rates by spending more. Instead, they may prefer to add to their cash balances because they believe either the economy will slow further and they need protective funds, or that prices may drop and offer better purchase opportunities later. They may pay down debt in a process referred to as deleveraging. Thus, the psychology and likely responses of consumers and companies must be considered. If an economy is doing well, general optimism about income, employment, and business profits may be high, and increases in borrowing costs are less effective in deterring spending. At other times, an increase in interest rates may be effective because optimism is less established. So now we're moving on to fiscal policy and the tools of fiscal policy. So fiscal policy involves the use of government spending and taxes. So that's the important thing to understand. Fiscal policy is all about spending and taxes to influence the level of aggregate demand in an economy. So an expansionary fiscal policy to stimulate a weak economy would reduce taxes and increase public spending. So public spending could be on roads, bridges, harbors, terminals, etc. Government spending to put people to work. And also expansionary policy would be to reduce taxes, okay? The effectiveness of these policies will vary over time and among countries depending on circumstances. This slide is looking at limitations of fiscal policy. So there's time lags and there's other factors. So time lags include recognition of the economic change that requires fiscal policy action. Then there has to be a decision on the fiscal policy response, either increase or decrease taxes, increase or decrease spending. Then there has to be implementation of the decision, and then there needs to be the responses to the changed fiscal policy. In other words, it takes time for policymakers to recognize that a problem exists, for decisions to be made and implemented, and for actions to occur that affect the economy. By the time the actions affect the economy, economic conditions may have already changed. And some other factors is that there may be unexpected responses or unintended consequences to the changes in the fiscal policies. So we're down to the final slide for Chapter 5 on macroeconomic policy. And it's looking at, the debate between fiscal or monetary policy. So both governments and central banks are concerned with economic growth, inflation, and unemployment. Each entity has different tools at its disposal to affect economic activity. Government tools include taxes and government spending. That's the fiscal policy, okay? And central bank tools include open market operations, central bank lending rates, and reserve requirements. Keynesians, named after British economist John Maynard Keynes, believe that fiscal policy can have powerful effects on aggregate demand, output, and employment when there is substantial spare capacity in the economy. Monetarists believe that fiscal policy has only a temporary effect on aggregate demand, and that monetary policy is a more effective tool for affecting economic activity. However, in practice, both governments and central banks are likely to act in response to economic conditions. Okay? And that's the last slide for the final learning outcome statement. So just a quick reminder, after I've gone through reading through all the content, I'm going to make sure that I cover off the summary, and then I'm going to move in and I'm going to start my practice with regards to the chapter. You can see here I've done my practice, and again, after you've done your practice, you can do your review, see the questions that you got wrong, maybe sort them from in terms of the categories, easy, moderate to difficult, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to review the question that I got wrong, and then I'm going to click in, and there's the learning outcome D that question was referring to, and I'm going to scroll through and find where I made my mistake with regards to that question, and that's the process. And that is the conclusion for this video for the CFA Institute Investment Foundations program on Module 3, Inputs and Tools, Chapter 5, Macroeconomics. Thank you.